Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is October 16th, 2018, and I am very excited for today's topic and today's guest. Many of you will remember that a few months ago, I interviewed Dr. Bart Ehrman, the author of Jesus Interrupted and several other books, Misquoting Jesus, God's Problem, Forged, How Jesus Became God. And we spent an hour talking to Bart Ehrman about his scholarship on the New Testament and, his findings, his research, and his beliefs on things like, was there a historical Jesus? Was there a person named Jesus who existed? How did, his view of how Jesus came to be viewed as divine or the Son of God? Who wrote the New Testament, how the New Testament was put together, whether or not there are contradictions in the New Testament, especially the four Gospels, how the New Testament was assembled and changed over time, kind of his thoughts on the historicity of these sorts of things and on a belief in Christianity overall. And it was a real honor to interview Dr. Bart Ehrman. He's world-renowned, and I got a lot of good feedback about it. Some of the feedback I got was from believing Christians. And they basically said, hey, there's another side to the story. Bart Ehrman is one voice, but there are a lot of credible scholarly voices out there who believe differently than Bart and who see the Bible differently than Bart and who have religious beliefs differently than Bart, and you should have them on as well. So that's what we're doing today. I have a dear, dear listener named Emily Robbins. She is the one who lined up our interview or helped line up our interview with the South Mountain Christian or Community Church in Draper. That was a good experience. And she was the one who reached out to me most and said, hey, if I can get a couple, top-notch, thoughtful, scholar or apologists for Christianity on Mormon Stories, would you interview them? And I said, absolutely. So it took her some time to find the right people, and it took us some time to get it scheduled. But today, I am really excited to have two gentlemen on this podcast. Dr. Frank Turek, he runs an organization called Cross-Examined, and I'm going to have him tell you about himself in just a second, what his organization is. And also Dr. Mike Licona. Mike is a New Testament professor and scholar at Houston Baptist University, and he's a New Testament scholar in his own right. Both of these gentlemen are sought after around the world for their, scholarship and or apologetics. And we're going to give them a chance to make their case for a belief in Christianity in 2018 and to respond to Bart Ehrman's podcast, because as I understand it, they've listened to it, they're familiar with his works, and they're going to make their best case. Now, I'm going to warn everybody, my goal is not to argue or to try and represent Bart Ehrman to, Frank and Mike. I'm not qualified to do that. And generally on Mormon Stories, our focus is not adversarial debating sort of stuff. So if you're expecting some sort of hot debate, that's not what we're going to do. But I will ask questions. I'll do my best to sort of follow up and represent, some of the things that I remember from my interview with Bart, but also we're doing this live and we've got 64 people joined us live so far. We would welcome listeners to post questions and comments, and I'll do my best to integrate those throughout the interview. But we're going to do about a 2-hour interview, and we're really excited to have these guests here today. And of course, thank you, Emily Robbins, for making all this possible. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask each of our guests to kind of introduce themselves. And the first person I'm going to ask to introduce himself is Dr. Mike Licona. So Mike, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast.
Well, thanks, John. A pleasure to be here with you guys. I'm 57 years old and grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. And now my wife and I live in the Atlanta area. Our 2 kids are down here as well. And my son's a firefighter, and my daughter and her husband live a little way from here. They both have Asperger's, but great people. And my son-in-law has a podcast called the Deeper Waters Podcast. Very smart guy. So happy to be here.
And tell us just a little bit about your scholarly, your background. People think, oh, Bart Ehrman, University of North Carolina, he's a New Testament scholar. He knows the real deal. He's values science and intellect and logic and thought. So give us your sort of academic bona fides or bona fides or however it's pronounced, just so we understand that you also have a scholarly background.
Well, I became a Christian at the age of 10. And of course, at that point, my epistemological processes weren't fully matured. And when I went to college, I was a music major. And then I just fell in love with the Bible and really grew in my Christian faith and a lot of time in prayer. Got in graduate school for a degree in New Testament studies and wanted to be able to read the New Testament in its original language. Was loving it. But then one day I just started asking myself whether it was true. Fell into a period of serious doubt that lasted for several decades. I did something I never thought I would do. I did a PhD in New Testament studies. I focused on the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Writing a 20-page double-spaced paper with a few footnotes. It was a nightmare for me in grad school, but my dissertation ended up being over 500 pages single-spaced and more than 2,000 footnotes. It's about 3 to 4 times the size of an average doctoral dissertation. And during that period, I engaged in...
What was the topic?
Whether Jesus rose from the dead. It turned into a book that has subsequently published titled Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach. So, John, what I wanted to do was approach the resurrection of Jesus through the eyes of a historian, using the same tools that a historian would use to see if it would come out, if the resurrection of Jesus looked like it could be verified historically. When you verify something historically, you don't do it beyond all doubt. You go with the explanation, the hypothesis that can explain the data better than any others. So that's what I wanted to see. And during that time, I engaged in several public debates with leading scholars to see how they would do. One of those was Bart Ehrman. And Bart and I have subsequently become friends. I like the guy, and we get along quite well, even though he's wrong.
Have you guys ever debated or had a public conversation?
Oh, we've had 6 debates, 6 debates. 5 of them were live, and then 2 years ago we had one that was a written debate. Most of them have been on whether Jesus rose from the dead. 2 of them have been on the historical reliability of the Gospels.
Okay, so you're familiar enough and sort of appear enough with Bart Ehrman that in 6 different venues, at least, you guys have had either live or written, exchanges or debates.
Yeah, we go at each other in a very collegial, friendly way, and we have a good time together.
You were telling me before the show that there's some global society of New Testament scholars that you're part of. I just want my audience to know that that you've got as much legitimacy as Bart, or comparable. So I don't want you to be bashful. So tell about the membership in that society or whatever it is.
I don't share it with too many, to be honest with you, because I hate folks with egos, and I mean it. I never want to come across as having one. But yeah,
you can blame me for this.
Yeah, last year in August, I was voted into membership in the Society for New Testament Studies. Bart's a member of that, has been already a member for some time. He's been in the field longer than me. And so that is like an elite organization that you can't apply for. 2 of its members have to nominate you. You have to do several groundbreaking research, literature, scholarly literature that it's anticipated is going to have a lasting impact in the field of New Testament. Not all the scholars in this are Christians, like Bart Ehrman. He calls himself an agnostic atheist. So I had my big dissertation published, which is over 700 pages in the form. And then I had a book published by Oxford University Press last year on gospel differences and approach to gospel differences. And because of that, I got voted in. And if you have anyone that objects to it, any one of its members, and there are just a little over 800, then you're denied membership. So if you get membership in it, you're considered a serious star in the field.
Okay, great. Well, it's a real honor to have you on Mormon Stories Podcast, Mike.
Oh, thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Okay, Frank, tell us about your background.
My background, John, is I was brought up in New Jersey, so by law I was Catholic. And I went to Catholic high school, but I left there not really knowing who Jesus was. I knew there was a God, and I always believed in God regardless of Catholicism. And I went off to college and then into the Navy. And I actually came to faith when I was in the Navy, reading Josh McDowell books, Evidence Demands a Verdict, More Than a Carpenter. I said, wow, it seems like the New Testament documents are reliable, that Jesus really did rise from the dead. Then after the Navy, about a year after I got out of the Navy in 1992, I met a man by the name of Norman Geisler, who was starting a seminary here in Charlotte. And I didn't know who he was at the time, but he was at the time kind of the Michael Jordan of apologetics. And he invited us to come down to Charlotte and attend the new seminary he was starting. So we did. And one thing led to another. I found myself doing presentations with Dr. Geisler, and we wrote a couple of books. One of the books is called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. I've since written some other books. Another one's called Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. And about 11 or so years ago, 12 years ago now, we started a ministry called crossexamine.org. And what we do primarily is we go to colleges, high schools, and churches and present evidence that Christianity is true based on the book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And we do TV and radio. We're on the NRB TV network, and we do radio on the American Family Association network. And all that they can see on our website, crossexamine.org. I have a wonderful wife. I have 3 sons. 2 of them are in the Air Force, and one's an intel officer, so he's reading your email right now. And the second son is a KC-10 pilot, which means he refuels other planes in flight. So what he does is he flies up to 30,000 feet every day, and he sits around, and he passes gas. And he gets paid for it. So, and the third son is an engineer here in Charlotte. So that's my story. We have one of them married, no grandkids yet, but my wife is getting impatient.
All right. We got a jokester on our hands, Mike.
He's hilarious.
Frank, welcome to Mormon Stories Podcast. It's great.
Thank you. And let me say one other thing, John, and I said this before, but I want everybody to know that your interview with Bart Ehrman was amazing in that you covered 7 books in 1 hour. That has got to be a record.
Yeah, I got some grief. For that.
No, that was good. You know how to keep a guy on track.
Well, Bart wouldn't give me more than an hour. You guys are giving me 2, so,
All right.
So I appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to ask both of you. I grew up in a Baptist town in Katy, Texas, and I spent my high school years sort of defending Mormonism against angry, Baptists that thought Mormonism was a cult. I'd love to hear each of you just talk about your do you have any experience or impressions about or with Mormons? Mike, let's just ask you first. Have you had any background or history or experience with Mormons or Mormonism? And if so, what has that been? I'm just curious.
Yeah. I would say,
I'm basically saying, are we a cult? No.
It depends how you define cult. I would say as a sociological cult, no. A theological cult, I would say yes. So not like a Jim Jones or Branch Davidians or anything, but I'd say that the theology of Mormonism is quite different than the apostolic Christianity, in my opinion. So my first real exposure to it would have been probably 1995, maybe a couple of years earlier. And I ran into a guy from Indiana. He and his wife lived in Virginia Beach at the time where my family was. And we struck up a friendship. He was a former Mormon bishop. And he and his wife were just faithful Mormons. And, we developed a friendship, and he knew I wasn't a Mormon, and he knew that I knew that he was, and we both knew that we wanted to talk about this at some point, but we didn't know when. And so we developed this friendship until we both were assured that we loved and respected one another. And then he broached the topic one day, and he asked if I'd be willing to talk to some Mormon missionaries, and I said, sure. And I said, but I don't really care about everything that Mormons believe until I know that Mormonism is true. So what I will want to focus on is evidence, because evidence means a lot to me. So that's what I will want to discuss with them. So he said, fair enough. And so they prepared for that and invited me over, and I came over, and so they shared some stuff. And then they challenged me to read the Book of Mormon and to pray with an honest, sincere heart and open mind. I agreed to do that because I wasn't threatened by truth. I've always felt that truth is, well, I shouldn't say always, but I do believe that truth is something we should seek with sincerity, and that we have nothing to fear with it. What we have to fear is that our biases will be so strong that they will blind us from seeking and discovering truth, and it may cost us eternity. That's my greatest fear. And I realized I had biases, so I prayed with a sincere heart, Lord, if Mormonism is true, I want to know it, I want to follow it. I read through a significant portion of the Book of Mormon. And then I also contacted Mormon scholars at BYU out in people like Dr. David Johnson, who's a Book of Mormon archaeologist in North America, specifically up in Palmyra, New York, and also John Clark, Dr. John Clark, who is a Book of Mormon archaeologist in Central America. Again, both of them are professors at BYU, and I'm checking with them what the Mormon missionaries are telling me, and they're saying that what the church was telling them was wrong, that although we could confirm that peoples actually lived in Central America and North America during the times that the Book of Mormon was allegedly written, there was not a shred of archaeological evidence that would confirm that those peoples specifically were Book of Mormon people who had come over from Jerusalem in 600 BC. So I shared that with the Mormon missionaries, and it's like, whoa, it shocked them. And then I looked into it further about the Book of Abraham, the Pearl of Great Price, and just discovered Joseph Smith was a charlatan. He had no idea what he was doing when he was translating the Book of Mormon or the Pearl of Great Price. He was a false prophet. And I ended up writing a little book that went out of print. They can download it on my website. It's called Behold, I Stand at the Door and Knock, What to Say to Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses When They Knock on Your Door.
All right.
That's my experience with Mormonism. I've always found them to be very pleasant people.
Well, I hope we haven't lost our believing Mormon listening audience, but it's important for you to just kind of state your background, and I appreciate that. And for those of you who are still believing Mormons, don't drop out just because Mike feels that way. Today is not about Mormonism. Mostly it's about Jesus and God in the New Testament. So anyway, Mike, thank you for sharing. That's really useful and interesting. And I'm sure for some validating, depending on who you are. All right, Frank, any interactions or history with Mormons or Mormonism?
Yeah, so I probably haven't had as many interactions as Mike has had, but I went to a seminary here in Charlotte that dealt with different worldviews. And so we studied Mormonism a little bit, and I've had some interaction with Mormons over the past couple of decades. I'll never forget one. I was having dinner with a gentleman who had hired me because I was doing training for businesses for many years. And he was a Mormon. He was telling me a little bit about his faith, and he seemed to indicate that Mormons were polytheists. And since I've done some research, that seemed to be the case. And so I talked a little bit about the fact that it appears that space, matter, and time had a beginning out of nothing, which means the cause must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful to create the universe out of nothing, personal in order to choose to create, and also intelligent, because you have to make a choice, you got to be intelligent. Turns out also this universe is fine-tuned. It seems like that all goes back to one being. And so I asked him, what would be the Mormon belief on that evidence? This is scientific evidence. There's philosophical evidence the universe had a beginning. And he just said, well, we don't go back that far. That's all he said to me. And I thought to myself, what do you mean you don't go back that far? That's where the evidence seems to point, that there's one cause, one creator, one immaterial being that brought this all into existence. And the thing that maybe you can help me with, John, because I never understood the the issue with the golden plates, and maybe you being with your background in Mormonism can explain it to me. Why do people think that golden plates are miraculous? Because obviously you can make golden plates if you have the right materials. It's not like something has come down from heaven necessarily if it's gold. So I never understood that, why that seems to be some sort of confirming miracle for Mormonism.
It wouldn't be golden plates in and of themselves. It would be golden plates delivered by an angel.
But how can you show it's delivered by an angel, I guess?
The same way you could show, I mean, I'm sure a secular person would say the same way you could show Jesus was resurrected.
Right, but if Jesus is resurrected, if everyone knows he's dead and then he's resurrected, there's no human being that could do that. But somebody could make golden plates. Any human being could make them with the right material. So I'm just trying to understand the Mormon position. I'm not trying to push back at all.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to.
The Mormon position would be any time. If it was a roll of toilet paper, if an angel delivered it, it would be miraculous if it's an angel delivering.
Oh, sure. If an angel delivered, that's the big if. I understand.
Yeah. And I think Mormons would say the book that was produced from the golden plates is so spiritual, so theologically and doctrinally and historically complex and sophisticated and powerful. I think most believing Mormons would say the miracle of Mormonism and of the gold plates and of the Book of Mormon is the impact that it's had on millions of lives in a positive way. And lately the church would say the miracle of the golden plates in the Book of Mormon is how many people it's brought to Christ. Now that's something that's kind of relatively, I would say, new in terms of what the church's messaging would be. But more and more, believe it or not, the church seems to be trying to emphasize Christ as the central purpose of the church.
Yeah, it seems similar to the Muslim view that the Quran, look how beautiful the surahs are, they'll say. And so therefore, no human being could create this kind of surah, this kind of subjective test. Is it similar to that, would you say? Is that the
for sure. There's this idea that Joseph Smith was this uneducated, ignorant farm boy yokel. There's no way that an uneducated farm boy could produce such a sophisticated book that is so powerful, that has chiasmus, that has all these different societies and civilizations and language structures. Yeah, there's a whole line of Mormon apologetics that has built a whole, library of books and articles talking about how miraculous the Book of Mormon is.
Well, let me echo something Mike said. I agree. Most Mormons I know are great neighbors, great people. But I agree with Mike that when you look down at the evidence, it's lacking for what they believe, particularly with regard to Joseph Smith, and certainly with regard to the idea that there are many gods and that God is physically a man. God the Father is physically a man. That doesn't comport well with Christian theology, philosophy, or scientific evidence.
Well, that's cool. And maybe we can circle back to Mormonism. Today, the focus is on Christianity and the Bible.
Right.
So let's dive in. And I'm just going to go through these 7 points that we talked about with Bart. And I'll give each of you guys your best take. Maybe I'll always start, if it's okay, I'll always start with Mike. And then I'll have Frank add color. Is that okay?
That's right. Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So the first question I asked Bart was, did the historical figure we know as Jesus actually exist? And I'm going to just say my best memory of what Bart said is that Bart leans towards saying, yes, there was a historical figure, who we sort of associate with Jesus or whatever. And in his experience, that's not a very controversial position. In other words, my memory of what he said is that there are a lot of secular scholars and religious scholars who are sort of in agreement that there was a historical figure named Jesus who lived around the time the Bible says and who taught things comparable to what is mentioned in the Bible, and that there might even be evidence that he was killed for his beliefs or even crucified. And that someone would be a scholar, a New Testament scholar would probably be in the minority if they held the position that there was no such thing as a historical figure, that we know as Jesus. So without any further ado, Mike, what's your understanding of the consensus, if there is one, and what's your best understanding of the evidence that would support that position?
Well, I think you summarized Bart pretty well there, John. He probably holds a stronger position even than the way you articulated it. So, I mean, he's on record, I think, in one of his books is saying that Jesus' death by crucifixion is one of the most certain facts of the ancient world. And Bart's actually, as you probably know, he's written a book on the existence of Jesus. It is not a subject that is a live discussion amongst New Testament scholars and historians. And in fact, probably the leading scholar who proposes that Jesus never existed is Richard Carrier. And before him, it was pretty much just a discussion that took place amongst internet atheists. But then Richard Carrier came along, legitimate scholar, legitimate degree in ancient history from Columbia University, and he's written contending that Jesus never existed. But by Carrier's own count, at least the last I heard a few months ago, including himself, there were only 8 scholars in the entire world who would say that Jesus did not exist. And there are actually more scholars who deny the Holocaust than there are who deny the existence of Jesus. And so those of us who are in the field, actually just when we hear someone say Jesus never existed, it's just kind of crazy. It's, I mean, you think of early contestants on the old show American Idol, and, you know, they come in and they have no talent at all. But they get on there and they're so confident and everybody's kind of rolling their eyes and laughing underneath. That's how scholars typically view those who deny the existence of Jesus, because there's so many different sources that mention Jesus. Not only the early Christian sources, but you do have some non-Christian sources like Josephus, Tacitus, Lucian, Marabar Serapion. And in order to explain those away, Jesus mythers have to go to great lengths and torture the text and produce just ridiculous things in order to try to explain them away.
So let's flip to the positive. So those authors you just mentioned and others, what would have been written about the historical Jesus? What things have been written and what are those sources and who wrote it and what did they say? Just kind of like a 3-minute summary of what people would have written.
You have Josephus is probably the earliest, and he's a Jewish historian who writes at the end of the 1st century. He was born like 7 years after Jesus died, and he grew up in a famous Jewish family where in Jerusalem, the very part where the disciples are proclaiming Christ. His father is a popular priest named Matthias in Judaism. And so this is something that interests Josephus. And he basically, in his Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, section 3 or 63, he mentions, and it's a disputed passage, but the majority of Josephus scholars will acknowledge that he mentions that Jesus was this wise man who went around teaching. He got followers from Jews and Gentiles, that at the instigation, he was known as a worker of amazing deeds, that at the instigation of the Jewish leadership, Pilate crucified him. But his disciples continued and remain to this day. So that's like a toned down version of what we find in the actual Greek text of Josephus. Josephus mentions Jesus in an undisputed text in book 20, section 200, which he mentions Jesus, who was called the Messiah and was the brother of James, who was stoned. And then you've got Tacitus, a Roman historian at the beginning of the 2nd century, and he mentions Jesus being crucified or suffering the extreme penalty by Pontius Pilate, that Christianity was checked for a moment, and then it broke out again in Judea, where it started and spread throughout everywhere, even into Rome. That's pretty much an undisputed text. You've got Lucian of Samosata in the middle of the 2nd century. He mentions the crucifixion of Jesus in Palestine. Marabar Serapion is a prisoner. We're not exactly sure when he wrote, end of the 1st century or sometime in the 2nd century, and he mentions Jesus's execution. So, I mean, there's a few non-Christian sources that are relatively early that mention him. There's the Jewish Talmud, but it's pretty unreliable and it's late enough that it's based on hearsay and some of the things going around. But then you got multiple independent early sources based on eyewitness testimony there in the Christian writings that people like Ehrman, skeptics like Ehrman and others say we can know about Jesus. In fact, he says the best sources about Jesus are the New Testament Gospels.
Okay, so let me ask you, just to clarify, is there anybody who a contemporary of Jesus who wrote about Jesus? Or is it everyone, are all the writings we have about Jesus, were they written after Jesus died by people who actually didn't know or see him personally or live in the town or around in the area when Jesus was alive? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I don't know of anything that was written while Jesus was still alive. Okay. But we do have some literature that was written by those who knew, either those who knew him or written by those who knew him. So, for example, we have a guy named Papias who's writing probably somewhere between the years 98 and 109. And Papias said he heard personally from a disciple of Jesus, a minor disciple of Jesus named John the Elder. He had heard personally from him that Mark had recorded in his gospel what he had heard directly from Peter. So that is our first witness to who wrote the gospel. So you have Papias, who said who very early, right around the year 100, let's say, but early into the 2nd century, who said he had heard from one of Jesus' disciples, probably, so now we're backing into the 1st century, who this disciple of Jesus said that Mark wrote what he had heard from Peter. So that's pretty good. And then the majority of scholars today, without giving all the reasons, majority of scholars today, even skeptical ones, say that John's gospel, they don't believe it was written by John, the son of Zebedee, but they are willing to say that it was either written by one of Jesus's minor disciples, or that whoever the author was, he received his information from one of Jesus's disciples, perhaps even John, the son of Zebedee. So you have at least 2 gospels for which the majority of scholars believe they're based either on eyewitness testimony or those who knew the eyewitnesses. It's rooted in eyewitness testimony.
Okay. So if somebody were to kind of in a dismissive way say, well, you don't have any firsthand accounts, so that's a weak argument. As a scholar of antiquity, what would your response to that be? Even taking out the religious context,
Yeah.
Are there historical figures taken out of religious context that we all sort of like assume exists, and we all know we don't doubt their existence, but we have similar sort of distance in terms of confirmation that they actually existed as historical figures? Do you understand my question?
You think you believe Julius Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March?
Yes. I don't know,
well,
but let's just say
you don't
yes.
know if you believe he was assassinated on the Ides of March.
I mean, that's a common understanding, but the internet all the time says commonly held things that actually aren't true at all. So I'm open to the fact that but that's my understanding. Let's just say that.
Okay. So I don't think you'd find a single classicist today who would doubt, or a historian who would doubt that Caesar was assassinated on March 15th in 44 BC. So we have a number of sources who attest to that. Appian, Cicero, Dio, Livy, Nicolaus, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Velleius. The only testimony that's even close there to being an eyewitness testimony is Cicero. And the way his letter that he mentions this in, he doesn't even say he was there. So he would have been alive at the time, but he doesn't say he was there, but it's just assumed that he is. That is the closest thing we have to eyewitness testimony, something written by an eyewitness on the assassination of Caesar. So what we're looking at, and Plutarch, greatest biographer of all antiquity, and of the 50 biographies that he wrote that have survived, he's eyewitness to very, very little in it, and most of them he's reporting things that are more than 100 years removed from his own lifetime. Same thing with Suetonius, the greatest Roman biographer. So,
and that's basically what I'm asking you to, for people who aren't really into history or, classics or ancient stuff, is, what I'm asking you to basically confirm as your opinion is that pretty, I mean, and I think the answer is so many scholars agree with you and Bart. I think what you're saying is that's pretty good evidence for ancient documentation, the evidence for Jesus. You're saying
It's
even though
really
it's not,
good evidence.
even though it's not contemporary per se.
What we have for the Gospels, I mean, you're talking the majority of scholars today. Now, Bart said on your show that most scholars think that the Gospel of Mark was written around the year 70. Well, he's wrong with that. I've actually done a study with the assistance of my son-in-law, Nick Peters, and we've found 76 critical scholars since 1965. And actually, there are more scholars who think that critical scholars who think that Mark was written before the year 60 than there are that believe that he wrote after 70. The majority of critical scholars today think Mark wrote between 50 and 70.
And
so,
we're going to get to that in our third question about who wrote the New Testament.
Okay.
But you're saying Mark is an example. You see some of these New Testament Gospels as having been written maybe earlier than what Bart claims. Is that what you're saying?
Well, Mark, certainly, yeah.
Mark, certainly.
And I would say this, all of them are written within living memory of the eyewitnesses. In other words, there were eyewitnesses who were still around when all of them, even the last gospel, John, was written.
Okay. Really quick, a couple, and we're gonna get you in, Frank. Steve, shout out to Steve Otteson. He's made the comment, any professor in a secular school would disagree with what was just said about the Gospel of John. It's regarded as the least likely to have good information about the historical Jesus. And then my friend Daniel adds, and he's a PhD in classics, he says, bingo, it's the last written that was canonized and very Gnostic. What would you say to Daniel and Steve? And it's not going to be a back and forth, but they're asking it, so I just wanted to have you respond.
I'd say to the first one, he just needs to read the literature, actually, because and that was on John, the first one. I know the second was on John, the first one.
The first one's on the Gospel of John. That it's regarded as the least likely to have good information about the historical Jesus. That's what Steve says.
Well, I kind of understand why he would say that, because it is a different gospel for sure. So the way I look at John, and it's really difficult, even a conservative New Testament scholar such as N.T. Wright would say, I think of the Gospel of John like I think of my wife. I love her, but I don't claim to understand her. And so if you talk to Johannine scholars, they have different opinions. But John, I think most would agree that John has taken the Jesus tradition, paraphrased it loosely, and recast it in his own words in order to bring out the theological significance of what Jesus had said. And there's nothing wrong with that. John would have wanted to have done that when he sees the three synoptics, probably knew about the synoptic gospels, and he's wanting to do something a little bit differently rather than just kind of repeat what they had done. So, that's the way he writes. He writes, it's kind of like a theological paraphrase of the synoptic gospels. In terms of the second one, what did he say again? About majority of New Testament scholar, or no, he didn't say that. The first one said that.
Yeah, the second just said the last.
By the way, because John is rooted in eyewitness testimony, either written by an eyewitness or based on eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus' disciples. That's not to say it's unreliable. It's just to say it's not stated in terms of, word for word. He is paraphrasing and he's writing kind of a commentary on it as well. And the second one said, what was it about John?
Just he was just saying that the Gospel of John is very Gnostic. It was the last written.
It was the last written, but it's not at all Gnostic. I mean, there are some things in it that could be interpreted in that way, but Jesus, Gnosticism has this kind of goddess, Pistis Sophia, who is scattered throughout the earth, killed and scattered by her followers, and these pieces of divinity fall into individuals who have a spark. Some of them have a spark of divinity. Frank might have a spark of divinity, but I don't. But Jesus is fully God. He is, in John, he is before, he is with God. He is part of creation. He is incarnated on the earth, and he's full deity as well as full man. So that's not Gnosticism.
Okay. Really quick, Frank, let's bring you in. Is there anything you want to add to this discussion about Jesus actually existing?
Well, no, enough has been said on that. There's no way you can make a valid case that Jesus didn't exist. Not only do you have 8 or 9 sources that have found their way into the New Testament, as Mike said, there's about 10 ancient non-Christian sources within 150 years of Jesus's life that give the basic same storyline if you add up all the references that the New Testament gives. So it would strain credulity. You'd have to have more faith to believe Jesus didn't exist than to believe he did exist. And with regard to the Gospel of John, Denver Seminary professor Craig Blomberg went through the Gospel of John with a fine-tooth comb and found 59 historically probable or historically confirmed eyewitness details. And we list them all in our book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. In the book of Acts, there are 84 of these details, just from chapter 13 to the end of the book, chapter 28. Only an eyewitness could know some of the things that are mentioned there, or somebody that knew eyewitnesses. And the other aspect to John that, in fact, Mike and I were talking about this earlier today, John, in the 5th chapter, says, there is near the sheep gate a pool known as the Pool of Bethesda. Well, in 70 AD, the entire city of Jerusalem practically was wiped out. That pool did not exist prior to 70 or after 70 AD. Why is John writing as if the pool is still standing if he's writing in 95 AD? Now, he could be writing in 90 or 95 AD, but it seems quite odd for him to say there is this pool when he would know in 90 AD that the city and the pool have been destroyed. In fact, Dan Wallace, who's one of the top manuscript scholars in the world and has debated Bart Ehrman, just like Mike has, wrote a paper after going through hours and hours of research, wrote a paper back in 1990, and he came to the conclusion that he thinks that the Gospel of John is written prior to 70 AD. In fact, I would argue, John, that Luke is written prior to 55 AD because Paul quotes Luke, or it's written prior to 60 AD, because Paul quotes Luke in 1 Timothy 5:18, and he quotes it as scripture. So Luke is certainly prior to the 60s AD, and we all know that even Bart Ehrman admits that 1 Corinthians, which has the earliest evidence for the resurrection, the ancient creed in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 8, that book is written in 55 AD or 56 AD, but that creed that names all the people that saw Jesus alive actually originates, as Bart himself admits, very early back to the resurrection itself. So we have, even if the documents are written later, we have early testimony within those documents which confirm that this comes from an eyewitness source.
All right. Well, since there's a lot of consensus on this, I think we've covered it, and I think this has been great so far. So let's jump to the second question. Thank you both for that. Second question that we talked about with Bart is, how did the historical figure Jesus come to be viewed as divine / the Son of God? And I'll just say what I remember about Bart's sort of position, which is that if you line up the Gospels as we believe them to have been chronologically written in order, from Bart's perspective, the tale kind of grows, kind of like the fish gets bigger the more times the fisherman tells the tale of catching the fish. You have Jesus in the earliest gospel, and you'll be able to talk more about this, of course, Mike, but in the earliest gospel, you would have Jesus being more of a wise person, more of a philosopher, kind of a prophet. And then by the end, by the last gospel, let's just say it's John. If it's John, he's the Son of God, and he's divine, and he's resurrected. But that the story kind of grows with each subsequent gospel that's written later. Now, tell me, Mike, do I have Bart's kind of basic argument right? And if so, do you agree with Bart or do you not? And if not, how do you differ?
I would say the Bart of a few years ago, I would certainly agree with that. I'm not sure where he's at now. He's kind of morphed his position over the last few years. And I think he now thinks that some of the early Christians believed that Jesus was God. I might be wrong on that, okay, but in his book, How Jesus Became God. But I would disagree with anything he would say about, or anyone who would say that Mark does not present Jesus as God, or he presents a lower Christology
What's the
than
order?
John.
What's the order of the Gospels as you understand them to be written chronologically?
Most would say Mark was first,
Right.
and then either Matthew or Luke was next. Most, maybe just a slight majority, would go with Matthew, and then Luke very shortly thereafter, and then finally John.
So Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, maybe.
Yeah.
And so you're saying,
now,
okay, so what were you saying about Mark, the first that was written?
I think Mark has every bit the same Christology as John does. And here's why I say that. In my recent study on ancient biography and understanding gospel differences, the majority of scholars today, New Testament scholars, think that the Gospels are either ancient biographies or that they share much in common with it. And so we say, okay, well, what does that mean when they're ancient biographies? Well, they had some different rules than we have in writing. And their objective, according to Plutarch in his Life of Alexander, chapter 1, the most frequently appealed to text in all of Plutarch, he says that biography is to highlight the character qualities of the main person. So in other words, the biographer wants to take those deeds that person did and the things that he said in order to illuminate who this person is, what kind of person they were. And so when you read the Gospel of Mark through the lens of ancient biography, some things come out and it's really interesting. It starts off right in the very beginning. As Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his paths. Well, then it's not Jesus preparing the way for God's coming. It's John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus. What does that say in chapter 1 about who Jesus is? And then you come to chapter 2, Jesus heals a paralytic and forgives the sins. And the Jewish leaders say, well, that's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins. Chapter 3, you have Jesus who is casting out demons. And by that, he says he has bound the strong man who is Satan. Well, what human can bind Satan? Chapter 4, Jesus walks on water, something the Old Testament says that God does. He calms the wind, something God does. Chapter 5, he raises someone from the dead. The Old Testament says something only God can do. Others in the Bible did, but they did it with the power of God. Jesus did it in his own power. Chapter 6, Jesus walks on water, something the Bible says only God does in the Old Testament. You go throughout the entire Gospel of Mark and you have chapter after chapter that presents Jesus's deeds as doing things that only God does. And so that's the Gospel of Mark is showing that Jesus is God's uniquely divine, fully divine Son through his deeds. And let's not forget that Paul has every bit as high a Christology as John does. He is just compared the kenosis hymn in Philippians 2 with the prologue of John's Gospel, John 1 through 14. You'll find there's a lot of parallels. Jesus is pre-existent, and he comes down and takes on human flesh. So he's the creator of our universe. So he's the creator. He was serving in the role of God, and he comes down to earth. So, I mean, all this, it's like there's no evolution in Christology. It starts at the very earliest with Paul and is also reflected in Mark.
Okay. And Frank, what would you add?
Well, there's a brand new book by Larry Hurtado, who's a New Testament scholar. It's called Honoring the Son. And he's written voluminously on this, John. But the sum of the book is the fact that the New Testament, from the very beginning, the believers of the New Testament, or the believers of Jesus from the very beginning, are saying that Jesus is God. This is not something that develops. I mean, that Bart said, well, his followers later put this on his lips. No, they thought he was God from the very beginning. And when you go to a text like 1 Corinthians, you're talking about the Jesus and the communion that Paul talks about. I think it's in 1 Corinthians 11, which indicates that they're venerating Jesus as God. You look at the text in Philippians 2, where Jesus is claimed to be God. And there's text after text that talks about Jesus being God very early on. This is not something that developed. This is something that started from the very beginning. In fact, Hurtado makes the point that the very reason Paul, when he was Saul, not a believer in Christ, he was actually trying to persecute Christians. one of the reasons that he probably was persecuting Christians is because they were venerating Jesus as God. And so he was going after them for that. So this is very early. This is not an evolutionary kind of process that later generations decided Jesus was God. No, this came from in the very beginning of Christianity.
Got it. Okay. So from your guys' perspective, you would disagree that the Christology, as you called it, Mike, is different in Mark than, let's say, in John, and that instead you see Jesus as divine from the very first gospel.
Oh yeah, and
is
even
there
before,
an
perhaps.
evolution? Is there an evolution where at all? Do you see any sense of the tail getting taller and a little bit more, majestic or powerful? Do you see any credibility in that kind of perspective?
What I think I see, the difference between Mark and John is John isn't, he does a lot of Jesus deeds, but he has Jesus explicitly stating certain things that about him is his own divinity that we don't find in Mark. In Mark, we find Jesus claiming divinity through his deeds. So John, of course, as Christianity is going on, they're trying to say, how does this all work out? We are looking at the unity of God, one God. How does that work with Father, Son, Holy Spirit? And I think they did have to wrestle with that, and they continue to wrestle with it after the New Testament was written. But here's a question I think is pertinent here. Frank points out how Hurtado says that the earliest Christians believed that Jesus was God in some sense. And we do have Paul who is claiming this. And Paul in Galatians said that he ran his gospel past the pillars of the Jerusalem church, Peter, James, and John, to make sure he's preaching the same thing they were, and they certified that he was preaching the same thing. So where did these monotheistic, pious Jews get the idea that Jesus was God's uniquely divine Son, fully divine, if Jesus himself did not claim these things? I just don't think that you get there. The only way that you get these pious, monotheistic Jews who knew Jesus, who walked with him, and were saying that he is God's uniquely divine Son, is that the only way to get there is that Jesus made such claims.
Hey, John, can I mention one other thing?
Please, Frank.
Jesus also reveals that he's God in parables. Probably the most famous parable in the Bible is the parable of the lost son or the prodigal son. If you really look at that text, which occurs, as you know, in Luke chapter 15, what happens there is some of the Pharisees are there, and they are upset that they're muttering about this man welcomes sinners and eats with them. And then he tells them three parables. We can't go through them all. We don't have time. But, the lost coin, the lost son, and then the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And in any parable, there's always at least two characters represented. God is in the parable, and you are in the parable. And sometimes there's a third. If you go down to the lost son, it turns out that in the parable, Jesus is playing the role of the father, and the lost son are the sinners, the people that are open to repentance, and the older brother represents the Pharisees. So if you read that parable, you realize that the reason Jesus is meeting with sinners is because he goes out and he finds lost sinners. He goes out and he seeks people who are lost. And that's what God does. Jesus is claiming to be God in those three parables right there in Luke chapter 15. Now, he's doing it in a coy way, but he is inserting himself into the parable. He is representing the Father, and the Father represents God, whereas the guy that goes out and squanders everything are the sinners, and the righteous ones who stay home with their arms folded are represented by the Pharisees. And actually, this parable is misnamed. It's not the lost son parable, it's the lost sons, because both the one that went off and the one that stayed behind were lost. And only one really repented. It wasn't the one that stayed home. It was the one that truly went out and squandered his father's wealth. So Jesus, in fact, one scholar, Bart D, looked at 52 recorded narrative parables. And in those 52 parables, he said 20 depict Jesus in which the Old Testament typically refers to God?
Got it. Okay. Well, that's both of your best quick takes at question 2. Let's go to the third. Who wrote the New Testament? And my summary of Bart's argument is that it wasn't the people whose names are on the Gospels. So according to Bart, the John didn't write John, Mark didn't write Mark, Luke didn't write Luke, Matthew didn't write Matthew, but instead, as I recall, the argument was that different oral traditions were passed down, and one to 2 to 3 generations after these traditions were passed down orally, somebody wrote the story down and put and ascribed names to each of those gospels. So Mike, is that how you view it?
No, I think that's entirely fanciful thinking and without a shred of evidence for it. Bart will and others will say, well, the Gospels are not anonymous. They don't have the author's name in the preface or anywhere. But Plutarch, again, he's the greatest biographer of all antiquity, and we have 50 of his biographies that have survived, and his name appears in none of them. And Simon Gathercole at Cambridge just published an article in the Journal of Theological Studies last month, September. And in there, he provides a whole list of names of ancient historians and biographers in antiquity. And you won't find their name anywhere in the preface. And, just to give you some of the more prominent ones, Polybius and Arrian and Livy and Sallust and Plutarch, I mean, none of them have their names in the preface. So if you're going to say,
well, I want to make sure I understand. What I understand is that whatever earliest manuscript we have of, say, Mark, right, the actual earliest record, that there's no that the date that we have for its having been written is 1 to 2 to 3 generations after that person would have died. That's what
correct.
I understood.
Yeah, the titles.
So let's say Mark. Mark is the first written, right?
That's right.
So what's the earliest document we have of Mark, and how do we know that Mark wrote it versus someone else who wrote it who put Mark's name to it?
Well, first we do have Papias, who says that he heard directly from one of Jesus' disciples, John the Elder, that Mark wrote what he had heard Peter say. And you've got several, you've got at least 9 sources, no less than 9 sources by the time you get to the end of the 2nd century that attribute the Gospels to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it's unanimous. Now, it may not, their name may not have been in the title. What Gathercole argues in that journal article is that it's entirely irrelevant that their name does not appear in the title. Because if that is germane, then you have to say, well, we have no idea who wrote Plutarch's Lives. We have no idea who wrote the Antiquities of the Jews, because Josephus's name doesn't appear in there. We have no idea who wrote what was written by Polybius or Livy, because his name doesn't appear there. And of course we know who wrote those, because you have people who testify that they wrote them. Now, we may not know how they came to know it. Fortunately, we do with Papias. In most cases, we don't know how those people who testified to the authorship came to know that the author wrote those. But they do, back then, they knew who wrote them. And I think Bart's scenario of the swirling oral tradition that's totally uncontrolled, that's the form it had taken after 4 decades. That's what Mark included. I mean, that assumes that shortly after Jesus' death, his disciples went off on a permanent religious retreat and were never heard from again. But Paul's undisputed letters in the book of Acts discredit such a position, because they talk about the eyewitnesses continued to go out proclaiming the teachings of Jesus in the gospel for 2 decades and even longer. And that takes us right up to the very doorstep of when the first gospel, Mark, was written. So we have good reason to believe in the traditional authorship of the gospels. Matthew's a little bit fuzzy, but I do think that the evidence suggests that at minimum, he played a major role in the composition of that gospel.
Is it fair to say that the earliest manuscripts that we have don't date to, to a time when the various authors would have been alive? Does that make sense, the question I'm asking?
Yeah, that would be correct. And we would say that as well for just about every other ancient author. With the only exception I'm aware of at off the top of my head would be the Res Gesti of Augustus, which he wrote, and we still have some of that. So now we don't have it in his own handwriting. Okay, so we don't have the actual manuscript or anything that he wrote. So yeah, I guess, but it's fairly early. We have stuff, in a few cases, we have fragments that have been preserved that are within maybe a few decades, but those are extremely rare. They're only fragments, for the most part, of about 100 different pieces of literature, Latin literature from antiquity. Most of those manuscripts come from the 9th through the 16th centuries. So when you look at the New Testament and what we have an amazing richness of manuscript evidence. And even Ehrman himself will say there's nothing like it in the ancient world in terms of the quality and quantity of the manuscripts that we have for the New Testament literature.
So just for those who haven't studied this at all, how does it happen? Why isn't it that we have for sure manuscripts written by the hand of Mark or by the hand of Matthew? How did it work with ancient documents?
Well, of course, the originals of the Gospels would have been written on papyri, and unless papyri are stored away carefully, like in clay jars in the Qumran caves, they're just not going to last. They're going to last about 200 years is about what they're going to do, being handled and passed around. And that's why, the original Gospels are probably going to be passed around and handled and read often. And so over time, they're going to start to wear, and you're going to have scribes copy them. So we wouldn't expect to have the originals for any of the New Testament literature. Again, we don't have the originals. We don't have the originals for any ancient literature, period. Any of it.
Okay, so that's kind of an unreal. You're saying that that's maybe a bit of an unrealistic expectation.
Absolutely.
And that if we discard all the manuscripts that we don't have an original of by the original hand of the original author, we'd be discarding a lot of manuscripts that we basically just
everything.
Yeah,
we would be discarding everything from that period.
Okay. I wish Bart were here to respond, but he's not. But
he would agree with me on that.
Okay.
He would not agree with me on the authorship of the gospel thing, which I'd be happy to dialogue with him on that. If you want to bring us on and dialogue, I'd be happy to do that with him. Bart and I are friends.
Sure.
I respect him. I think he respects me. We'll have a spirited but collegial discussion. But I think he's just wrong on that.
Awesome. Okay, Frank, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd like to mention one thing, that even if you were to dispense with every manuscript from the ancient world, you could still reconstruct what Jesus came and said and did just by the early church fathers. In fact, a friend of mine is a cold case homicide detective. His name is J. Warner Wallace. And before you go to trial, any evidence from the crime scene has to be maintained uncontaminated, so it can then be analyzed in court. If somebody breaks that chain of custody, then the evidence is going to be in question. And what he has done in his book, Cold Case Christianity, and he's gone through and he's tracked all of the early church fathers from the apostles onward into the 3rd and 4th century. Names that Mike has mentioned, some of them are Papias and Polycarp and Irenaeus, people like this. And when you track them all the way into the 3rd century, you get a consistent view of what the New Testament says about Jesus, that he was born of a virgin, that he worked miracles, that he preached sermons, that he claimed to be God, that he was worshiped as God, that he was crucified and buried, that he rose from the dead, and he was ascended into heaven. So you get the same basic storyline, even if you don't have the manuscripts. Now, Bart Ehrman famously wrote the book, probably the one that put him on the map, as he said in your interview, called Misquoting Jesus. And if you read the book, as you read through it, you're going, wow, Bart seems to be throwing a lot of ambiguity or a lot of doubt on, can we really trust the New Testament that we have today? But when you read the second edition, John, and you go to the paperback version of the second edition, there's an interview with Bart Ehrman. And in the back of it, he writes this in the interview. It's just going to take me a minute to read this, but it's very critical. And you may remember that in the debate, in the podcast he did with you, he said he went to Princeton to study under Bruce Metzger. And he said there were no Christians at Princeton. What he forgot to say was Bruce Metzger was a Christian. He was the top manuscript scholar of the last century. And that's why Bart went there to learn from him. To Bart's credit, he went and learned from the best. Now, here is what Bart said in the second edition of Misquoting Jesus. This is on page 252. You can check it. He said, Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for getting into textual criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him. And even though we may disagree on important religious questions, he is a firmly committed Christian and I am not. We are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put into a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, unquote. In other words, Bart's saying that his entire book was really based on a false premise. His entire book was trying to get people to think that we don't have an accurate copy of the New Testament. But when he's interviewed in the second edition, he says, we really do have an accurate copy. And so I'm wondering if the book should have been called Misquoting Ehrman, because to call it Misquoting Jesus is, by Bart's own admission, not the case. And by the way, in order to know if somebody was misquoted, you'd have to know what the right quote was. How would you know someone was misquoted unless you knew what the right quote was? You couldn't. So if you push Bart Ehrman into a corner, he will admit that the New Testament documents that we hold today are the same New Testament documents that were written down 2,000 years ago.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'll just say, and Frank, I want to find a way to say this diplomatically, but I engage in a lot of apologetic discourse within Mormonism, and there's a discussion around these sorts of things that tries to stay around the facts, that tries to stay around the evidence, that tries to be as objective and as fair-minded as possible. And I think you both are doing that. So I'm not claiming that you're not. But for me, apologetics in Mormonism quickly can slide into, mean-spiritedness, nastiness, even ad hominem attacks, attempts to discredit, the authors, etc. And I'm not saying that you just did that, but I wanted to say that as you started talking, I just started to remember some of my less pleasant interactions with Mormon apologists. And I'm curious whether you guys have that same sort of dynamic in the sort of secular / Christian debates, because I don't ever want to do that to Bart. No. I'm not saying that you're doing that, but I started to have flashbacks of my interactions with Mormon apologists, and I want to make sure we don't do that here. Does that make sense?
Well, if I come across as too strong, this is me. This is how I present. I feel strongly about this stuff because I actually think that the book Misquoting Jesus, by Bart's own admission, if you look at, don't take my word for it.
No, we heard your argument.
Okay. Yeah.
I just want to make sure that and I'm not even calling you to account. I'm just stating something I haven't stated yet, which is let's try and keep this to the evidence and the facts and not, ad hominem or not.
Well, I hope I didn't do that.
No, just going forward. But I think you're adding an important point of view to the conversation. So I just wanted to stick that. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. No. Okay. If I go over the top, let me know.
Okay.
But
well, just do your best to self-monitor in that regard. That we're sticking to as best we can the discussion of the scholarship.
Yep.
But again, I'm grateful for your contributions. I don't want you to feel like I'm calling you to account, but I just.
No, that's fine.
Okay. All right. So I think we've made it clear that you guys. So just to circle back to you, Mike, is it your position again that Luke wrote Luke, Mark wrote Mark, Matthew wrote Matthew, and John wrote John? Is there anything to this idea, in your perspective, that Bart advances that they were written many years after, probably by other people who ascribed, names to the documents or authors to the document, but it wasn't originally authored by them? And doesn't he list historical events that were written into the text that would have happened after the various authors died, which to him would mean that they couldn't have written it?
Yeah, there are some things that he claims along those ways. So, for example, the story about the Jewish leaders coming up to Jesus and saying, or like, let's say with Nicodemus, right? He comes up to Nicodemus and says, except a man be born again, he cannot enter the kingdom of God. And that term, anothen, from again or above, it means both. It has a dual meaning there, which is not present in the Aramaic, which Jesus and Nicodemus would most certainly have been speaking in that language. And so he claims that whole story about Jesus and Nicodemus talking in John chapter 3 was invented. It never happened. To that, I would just simply say, well, he is right that there is no equivalent in the Aramaic. And I would also say that he's probably right that they spoke in Aramaic and not the Greek that we find in John chapter 3. But it doesn't take into account that John is writing loosely, a loose paraphrase, and he is restating things in his own idiom, which is Greek, and his own way of saying things. And as we find with Lucian saying in his little book, How to Write History, which he writes in the middle of the 2nd century, as we find Thucydides and Polybius discussing about writing speeches, you can take the speech and you can rewrite it in your own words and show off your oratorial skills. You want to communicate the same message, but you can rewrite it in your own words. And we find Tacitus, the greatest of the Roman historians, doing just this on a speech that I think it was Claudius Caesar who had made, accepting people up in Lugdunum, which is current France. They have a bronze plaque that they discovered up there, which is a verbatim transcript of what Claudius had said back in the 40s. And then we have with Tacitus, how he repeats it. And his speech is longer and it is more ornate, polished, but it communicates the same thoughts. So John could have just taken the as things were recalled in that conversation between Nicodemus and Jesus and recast it in the same sense. So in terms of the Gospels, I disagree with Bart when he says that we have no idea who wrote them. I think we have some decent ideas. I hold to the traditional authorship of Mark, that a guy named Mark heard directly from Peter and wrote down what he recalled Peter teaching. I do hold to the traditional authorship of Luke, that he was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, who received his information from Mark as his primary source, and some other sources that perhaps that Q source, and some special material that Luke knew from either eyewitnesses or those who knew them. I'm not sure what I hold regarding John's gospel. Over the years, I've held to the traditional authorship that it was John, the son of Zebedee. At this point, I lean in that direction, but I am open to it being a minor disciple of Jesus or someone getting their information from one of Jesus' disciples. Matthew's a little fuzzy. I don't really know what's going on there. But I do think, if I were to provide reasons, I could, but I don't want to take up too much time. I do think that Matthew played a major role in the composition of that gospel.
Okay.